The Caribbean has long represented a geographic area where American naval dominance went largely unquestioned. Since the Cold War's end, the assumption that these waters fell within an exclusive U.S. sphere of influence shaped policy, military planning, and diplomatic engagement across the Western Hemisphere. Yet in recent years, that assumption has faced quiet but persistent challenges. When Russian naval vessels began making port calls in Venezuela with increasing frequency, many observers dismissed these as symbolic gestures, diplomatic theater with minimal strategic substance. But the pattern of engagement suggests something more significant: a deliberate effort to establish presence in waters the United States has treated as its own for generations, testing whether American dominance remains absolute or whether the hemisphere's geopolitical landscape is entering a genuinely multipolar phase. Venezuela's strategic position. Understanding why Venezuela matters requires examining its geographic and resource position. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven petroleum reserves, exceeding even Saudi Arabia's, along with substantial natural gas deposits and mineral wealth. Its Caribbean coastline stretches nearly 3,000 kilometers, providing strategic maritime access that few Latin American nations possess. Yet this resource wealth has become a curse as much as blessing. Economic dependence on oil exports left Venezuela vulnerable to price fluctuations and sanctions. Once a regional energy powerhouse, Venezuela's Navy and Air Force have deteriorated through years of underinvestment and international isolation. Ships rust in ports. Aircraft sit grounded due to lack of spare parts. Despite this decay, Venezuela's geographic position remains strategically significant, a potential bridge between South America and Caribbean maritime routes. The Monroe Doctrine's modern echo. For 2 centuries, American foreign policy toward Latin America operated under assumptions codified in the Monroe Doctrine. Written in 1823, this policy declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to external powers, positioning the United States as the region's guarantor and de facto hegemon. While never formalized as international law, the Monroe Doctrine shaped American strategic thinking through the 20th century. But Russia and increasingly China have tested these assumptions. For Moscow, Venezuela offers more than ideological solidarity. It provides a platform to project power thousands of kilometers from NATO borders. The symbolism is unmistakable. If the United States operates near Russia's borders, Moscow will demonstrate it can reciprocate near America's shores. This isn't the first time Russian warships have appeared in these waters. In 2008, the battlecruiser Pyotr Veliky and its escorts arrived in Venezuelan ports for joint exercises, marking the first major Russian naval deployment to the Caribbean since the Cold War's end. Venezuela's crisis and turn eastward. Venezuela's government, led by Nicolas Maduro following Hugo Chávez's death, faces multiple converging crises: political isolation, economic collapse, and military deterioration. U.S. sanctions have systematically squeezed the country's oil revenues, restricting access to global finance and technology. In response, Venezuela turned to non-Western partners, Iran, China, and Russia, seeking investment, energy cooperation, and security assistance. Maduro's government sent direct appeals to Moscow requesting radars, aircraft maintenance, missile systems, and drones. Intelligence reports revealed these appeals were personal, handwritten letters to Vladimir Putin requesting protection from what Caracas characterized as foreign aggression. For Russia, the decision represents political calculation as much as strategic opportunity. By establishing presence in the Caribbean, Russia challenges Washington's hemispheric dominance, distracts U.S. attention from Europe, and demonstrates to allies that Moscow can still project power globally despite Ukraine commitments. American counterpresence. The United States has responded with its own shows of force. In 2025, Washington significantly increased naval presence in the Caribbean, deploying destroyers, a nuclear-powered submarine, and an amphibious assault ship carrying thousands of Marines. Officially, the mission focuses on counter-narcotics, interdicting drug routes allegedly controlled by Venezuelan and Colombian networks. Unofficially, it demonstrates American command of regional seas. U.S. ships patrol international waters near Venezuelan coasts, monitoring, intercepting, and signaling readiness. The result creates a triangular standoff. Venezuela under pressure seeking allies, Russia testing its reach and influence, and the United States determined to maintain control of its near seas. Every naval maneuver, every port visit, every radar activation carries potential for escalation. A modern echo of Cold War rivalries, smaller in scale but charged with comparable tension. Smaller in scale but charged with comparable tension. Venezuela's military reality. Inside Venezuela, the military reality is sobering. The once proud Bolivarian armed forces struggle to maintain equipment. The Navy's surface fleet, largely composed of older European vessels, has limited operational range. Its submarines are few and rarely deployed. The Air Force depends on Russian-made Su-30 fighters, of which fewer than a handful remain flight-ready due to maintenance challenges. Against this backdrop, appeals for Russian assistance become understandable. Venezuela isn't preparing for conquest. It's struggling for survival and relevance. For Russia, even limited naval presence carries symbolic weight. A destroyer or frigate making a high-profile port visit to La Guaira instantly commands international headlines. Joint exercises, anti-submarine drills, air defense simulations, radar calibration transform into geopolitical signals. Russia doesn't need permanent fleet deployment to change strategic calculations. Periodic presence suffices to remind Washington that no ocean remains off-limits. Operational challenges. Yet operational challenges are immense. The Caribbean lies far from Russia's logistical hubs. Long supply chains, maintenance demands, and geopolitical risks make sustained deployment difficult. Moscow's resources remain stretched by Ukraine commitments and obligations in the Arctic and Pacific. Sustaining even a small flotilla in the Caribbean requires local support, possibly Venezuelan refueling or repair facilities, arrangements that could invite additional U.S. sanctions and further isolation for Caracas. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy operates on entirely different scales. With global bases, carrier groups, and unmatched logistics, it projects power anywhere. From Key West to Curacao, from Guantanamo to Puerto Rico, U.S. Southern Command maintains extensive facilities and partnerships covering the Caribbean basin. Any Russian activity faces close tracking, often shadowed by American surveillance assets and submarines. The asymmetry is enormous, yet symbolism and political optics may matter more than raw numbers. Risks of miscalculation. Analysts caution that symbolism can prove dangerous. The proximity of competing naval forces in narrow waters increases miscalculation risks. Close encounters at sea, radar locks, or aircraft interceptions could spark unintended confrontations. Both sides understand these risks, yet continue operating near boundaries. For Venezuela, Russian ships' presence offers psychological reassurance. For Russia, it demonstrates continued relevance. For the United States, it justifies sustained vigilance. Jeffrey Sachs's perspective on multipolarity. Economist and policy expert Jeffrey Sachs has long argued that single superpower eras are ending. Multipolarity's rise appears inevitable. Nations seeking autonomy, regional influence, and alternatives to U.S. dominance. In this framework, Venezuela's partnership with Russia fits larger patterns. It's not merely about weapons, but asserting rights to choose partners and reject external dictates. Sachs has criticized economic and political isolation of countries like Venezuela, warning that sanctions often entrench hardship and push nations toward authoritarianism and rival alliances. From this perspective, Russia's naval engagement isn't random. It's a direct consequence of years of isolation policies. When countries feel cornered, they seek any willing ally. In this case, that ally arrives under Russian flags. Challenging the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, written 2 centuries ago, assumed American authority over hemispheric affairs would remain uncontested. That assumption faces direct challenge. After the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, the United States stood at power's pinnacle with no ideological or military equal. There was opportunity to redefine global order around cooperation rather than rivalry. But that opportunity passed. Rather than welcoming Russia into post-Cold War frameworks, the United States expanded NATO eastward. First Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, then Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria. Each expansion was justified as spreading democracy. To Russia, it appeared as methodical encroachment. George Kennan, architect of Cold War containment strategy, called NATO's eastward expansion the most damaging mistake of U.S. policy in the post-Soviet era, understanding that any Russian leader would view NATO at its doorstep as existential threat. Venezuela under Chavez and sanctions. When Hugo Chavez won Venezuela's presidency in 1998 through democratic elections, his message threatened existing economic models. Venezuela's oil wealth should benefit the poor majority, not just elites or foreign corporations. Whatever one thinks of Chavez's leadership, he challenged U.S. economic dominance in its hemisphere. After Chavez's death in 2013, Nicolas Maduro inherited both the presidency and its adversaries. The United States ramped up pressure through comprehensive sanctions, not targeted at individuals, but broad measures devastating Venezuela's economy. The country was cut from global financial markets. Oil exports were strangled. Billions in government assets were frozen abroad. Effects were catastrophic. Venezuela's economy shrank over 75%. Inflation soared to unimaginable levels. Hospitals lacked basic medicines, and grocery stores sat half empty. Conclusion: the emerging multipolar order. As sanctions intensified, Venezuela's alliances shifted. The pressure meant to isolate Caracas instead drove it toward partnerships with countries familiar with American economic warfare: Russia, China, Iran. These nations don't share common ideology, but they share experience being on Washington's blacklist. In that common ground, new cooperation networks formed. What began as defiance evolved into strategy. Venezuela found in Russia not just sympathy, but partnership willing to invest, support, and shield it from total collapse. Russian energy firms poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector. Military collaboration expanded from equipment sales to joint exercises and advisory missions. Each Russian naval vessel docking in the Caribbean sent clear signals. If NATO operates near Russian borders, Moscow can respond near America's shores. The broader implications extend beyond ships and bases. They reveal how the world reorganizes itself. Multipolarity isn't theory anymore. It's emerging reality. Nations increasingly assert autonomy, seek regional influence, and pursue alternatives to US-dominated systems. Venezuela's turn toward Russia demonstrates this shift while warning about isolation's unintended consequences. The waters off Venezuela have become more than maritime territory. They're a stage where global order plays out in miniature. Power, prestige, loyalty, and ideology converge between Trinidad and Caracas. As Russian sailors stand watch, Venezuelan officers coordinate, and American analysts monitor from distant command centers, each side knows the other is watching, calculating, waiting. Perhaps this represents the new normal. A multipolar Caribbean where external powers compete through presence and persuasion rather than invasion. Or perhaps it warns that great power rivalries never disappear. They just find new waters. Venezuela's decision to embrace Russian naval support shows both weakness and sovereignty assertion. It demonstrates pressure's limits and defiance's persistence. The question for the future isn't whether Russia can sustain presence or whether the United States will respond. It's whether the hemisphere itself is ready for a new era where power is shared, influence contested, and no ocean belongs exclusively to any single nation. Share your analysis of this geopolitical shift in the comments, and subscribe for continued coverage of how global power dynamics are reshaping regional relationships across the Americas.